everybody, and welcome to another SWOP lunch break. SWOP, as you know, is the Society Work and Politics Institute. And today, Lesego Loate will be presenting something that comes out of his PhD research into mining in the Delmas area. And the paper that he'll be presenting today is called A Political Economy of Water Scarcity in Delmas, South Africa. Before I introduce Lesego, I'm going to hand over to Prashani Naidu, the director of SWOP, to say a few words. In terms of the structure of the overall day, after Prashani's spoken, I will introduce Lesego. He'll speak for about 30 minutes, and then we will have a discussion which we invite you all to participate in. So thank you very much. Enjoy the food, which is done by Mantis and the team at Breezeblock/Bitten. As always, wonderful. And yeah, thanks for being here.
Oops. Hi everyone, welcome. We thought that before we start today's session, we need to acknowledge the struggles that are going on at the moment in Gaza, Palestine. We also acknowledge the students who have come together in the encampment. And I wanted to start by reading from one of the Gaza monologues. We've been doing this over some time now. The Gaza monologues are testimonies written by a group called the Ashtar Youth in 2010 after the first war on the Gaza Strip. And unfortunately, these monologues are still real today. So I'm going to read one. You will have been able to collect and you will be able to take with you this set of monologues that we've put into a poster form, and we hope that others will also start reading together. We actually received this call to read the monologues from colleagues in Mexico who received a call from Argentina. So it's a way of also building community in different ways across different spaces. Okay. This was written by Anas Abu Aita, born in 1995. Since I was a small kid, I've dreamt of being a famous football player. I believed I would fulfill my dreams, but today there are a million obstacles in my path. Before, there were no playing fields for adults or even kids. Then the siege came and made everything worse. If I was the Prime Minister, I'd pay most attention to the Ministry of Youth and Sports. I would build playing fields everywhere, especially in schools, and I'd let the students play freely, not be kicked out by the school guard. I'd abolish all club fees and preserve all parks. But dreams, security, hope, and the future are all words that lose their meaning in a city that kills the smallest dream possible. I was a goalkeeper, and my friend Mohammed kept telling me, I'm going to get a goal, but I always stopped his goals. On the 7th of January 2009, a day in the war, I was sitting at the door of our house, and it was foggy, and someone came to tell me, your friend Mohammed was martyred. Of course, I didn't believe it. I went looking for my friend, and I was really scared of the idea of death. I got to the mosque and saw the closest friend in my life, Mohammed, wrapped in the flag of Palestine and torn into pieces. I cried a lot, and I was sad because I couldn't hug or kiss him, and I started holding him. We took him to the cemetery and buried him, and I kept sitting there, telling him I loved him, and I was really upset because he left me alone in this world. As I was leaving the cemetery, there was heavy bombing. I felt that the angel of death was following me and not leaving me alone. But thank God, I'm still alive. These are hard stories to read, but I think we also sit with difficulties that are not just in policy and on paper, but in everyday life. And Lesego is going to move us into a very different mode of thinking about possibilities for life. Yeah, we also have questions around what possibilities for life there are in the present here. So, Lesego.
Before Lesego begins, let me introduce him as a PhD candidate, soon to be graduate, whose research interests include coal mining water struggles, water use licensing, coal-centric socio-natural relations of water, water regulation of coal mines, water scarcity, and political economy. Lesego's email address is at the back of these working papers that we are sharing today. And if you'd like to get hold of him for any reason, including to give any feedback on this working paper or this presentation beyond what might be possible today, then that would be great. And so now, Lesego, I hand over to you. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Good day, colleagues. I'm grateful for your attendance and also grateful to the team at SWOP for putting together this seminar. So evidently I'll be discussing political economy of water scarcity in Delmas, South Africa, but with a question mark. This is an angle that I had to abandon in my PhD. If you're interested in finishing, you let some things go and hopefully come back to them later. So it's I explored it through a working paper that I did for SWOP. Basically what I look at is exploring ideas around the role of water regulation in the normalization of water scarcity and therefore water struggles in Delmas, South Africa. Water scarcity particularly for agricultural water users. And what I'm interested today in exploring through this seminar is can we perhaps consider water regulation and water regulatory practices as they contribute to water struggles, not as haphazard, but rather as an intentional extension of the state capital cooperation feature of the minerals energy complex. So just as we see state capital cooperation in the MEC, in coal mining, in transportation of coal and coal export, etc., might it not be that even in water regulation, there is this state capital cooperation geared towards securing the coal supply for electricity generation. The methodology utilized was a case study methodology utilizing Funkhatfontein, Brakfontein, and Kangala coal mines as case study mines in Delmas. I use interview data, focus groups, and also observation. I focused on key informants, people that were knowledgeable about the local water use of the coal mines, the local water system, water struggles, and so on. And typically these were local coal mine officials, farmers, DWS, DMR officials, DWS is Department of Water and Sanitation, DMR, Department of Mineral Resources, and so on. The research site, Delmas, was chosen because it sits on the Witbank coalfield of the Central Basin coalfields, historically very critical for electricity generation in South Africa. You find a lot of electricity generation infrastructure there, coal mines, power stations, and also it just so happens to intersect with the Upper Olifants subcatchment of the Olifants Water Management Area, which is very important in terms of having a lot of water bodies. It's got the Butleng Dolomitic Aquifer, it's got seasonal wetlands, pans, streams, and these are all interconnected in the sense that in the rainy season, the wetlands sort of fill up, the wetlands and aquifer fill up in the dry season. When the wetlands are sort of dry, the aquifer fills them up. So by that I mean to say disruption of one element of that water system would definitely affect another. Also, it was selected because there are coal mines, farms, and also water bodies in close proximity, and the mines and farms depend on the same water bodies. Moving on to a conceptual breakdown. All right. Talking about water rights, water rights are discussed in literature as diverse. Diversity is in terms of the construct of the allocatory authority that allocates water rights, the enforcement authority that enforces the water rights, and even in terms of the claim authority itself. And obviously these interconnect, because obviously if you get a water right on the basis of being a member of a community, as in a collective water right, that also affects the way you will be allocated that water right. And also, we can consider water rights in terms of 3 dimensions: water rights holders, the construct of water as an object of value, the construct of water rights themselves, and the regulatory rights, regulatory rules connected to them. And these 3 dimensions are important because they can be critical in the way that they're constructed and they function to exclusion of people from being able to access and use water. For instance, if you're not defined as a water rights holder, you're likely not going to be able to get water, to be allocated water. And also the object of value is important in terms of the ontological framing of water. By that we mean what might come across as a mundane question of what is water is actually quite fundamental to also framing who's a water rights holder and who can access water and for what use. For instance, typically the sort of discursive notions that you'll find framing water, for instance, water scarcity, which is the framing of the water problems, which typically also are interconnected with other discursive notions linked to solutions of those water problems. For instance, efficiency, which would talk to the allocation of water to water uses that we consider to be efficient and don't waste water. Also, water can be considered as an economic good. Clearly, if you want to do other things, you want to go pray by the water, you're likely not going to get access if we're talking about that frame. In any case, also we can consider water as a bundle of rights. It speaks to the complexity of water rights. On the one side is allocation, access and withdrawal. On the other side, we can talk about water use. I think think let me move on from that. Covered that. Now, we can also, I think from what I was discussing earlier, it's quite clear that water regulation and water rights are integral. So the regulatory rules of water rights are integral to water rights, so you can't really discuss those separately. Now, talking about water struggles, we can talk about these in what is considered 3 domains of water justice, which is allocation, recognition, and participation. They sort of interlink or mirror water regulation. I think the easiest one to consider is allocation, because there's allocation in water struggles and allocation in water rights and regulation. But also recognition and participation are themes that flow through water regulation in terms of, excuse me, recognition speaking to categories like gender, forms of use, history, etc., that actually play a prominent role in the way that they are recognized in water regulation, in terms of allowing people to access water, or meaning that people cannot access water. And actually, if we think of that even in terms of equality, which seemingly seems like a very positive thing, the equality of recognition. Anybody can get this water in terms of the way the rules apply. But is that fair when you come as an individual and maybe I've got a huge multinational company and we're considered the same? Participation usually speaks to issues of participation in allocatory rules, but I like to expand it to talk about participation in terms of the ability of the allocatory and the enforcement authority to be able to exercise, to participate in the exercise of its authority. That'll come out as important later on, because that authority, that participation from the authority can be curtailed with negative impacts on water users. I think by and large, I've touched on the conceptual interconnections, but if I can just quickly, water regulation and water rights interconnected, and the way they touch on allocation, participation, and recognition in terms of the 3 domains of water justice has a direct impact in terms of water struggles. If there's unfair allocation, unequal participation, the results of that are inequitable regulatory practices and water struggles. I don't want to get into this in detail, water regulation in South Africa. Here, basically, I'm just outlining the framework for decision making on the allocation of water rights. Basically, a water allocation official at the Department of Water and Sanitation can't give you a water use license just because they like you or you are their friend or so on. There's a framework in terms of what I like to call the regulatory mandate, Section 2 of the National Water Act, that frames the way that government exercises its authority, its allocatory authority of water rights, and that's connected to the framing of water use licenses in or rather water rights as water use licenses in South Africa through the public trusteeship concept, where government holds water in trusteeship for all of us South Africans, or other people who live in South Africa. And also, so Section 21 talks about if there are certain water uses, maybe you change a water course, you withdrawing water, you will be discharging water, etc. You require a water use license. It exhaustively lists those uses that require a water use license. Section 27 outlines the considerations ranging from equity, impacts on water bodies, etc. A national water strategy ranks water uses into 5 priorities. And then also there's section 28 that specifies in terms of licensing conditions what is the licensed water use, who does it go to, for how long, 40 years typically, reviewed every 5 years, etc. Section 29 outlines outlines licensing conditions that relate to water use, which are critical to the enforcement of water use, allocated water use. Again, I'm going to say I don't want to get into this in detail. The MEC, typically very critical to our economy, a big employer, I think 90,000 or so people employed, 90 billion or so in wages, critical for foreign exchange reserves, coal, top export mineral, and beyond that, also the minerals energy complex, just critical in the way that our economy is structured in terms of cheap electricity for the cheap coal to generate cheap electricity for the extractive industries and to position that extraction for export, giving us foreign reserves. State capital cooperation, very critical to the minerals energy complex. Now, I want to move on to the water regulation of coal mines in Delmas. Now here, firstly, I want to talk about delays and failures in licensing, which came out as facilitating the extra legal and unregulated water use of coal mines, thereby normalizing the water scarcity for agricultural water users in terms of the pollution of water bodies. Now, these delays and failures were essentially delays and failures in licensing decision making by the licensing authority, which means the licensing authority failed to exercise its authority in allocating water use. And that gave coal mines an opportunity to engage in extra legal water use, all 3 of these case study coal mines. And behind that was the justification of commercial considerations, because, I mean, for instance, in the case of Frangat Fontaine, 7-year delay, and you've got all sorts of investments in a coal mine is, the other element of these water regulatory practices in Delmas is control over licensing decision-making. By control over licensing decision-making, I mean the very same extra legal water use that came from the failure of the licensing decision-making authority to exercise its authority. And that failure doesn't just come out of nowhere. It's clearly lack of capacity, which we can consider a political decision to not capacitate. I mean, on the other hand, arguments can be made about the licensing process itself is quite extensive, but by and large, the issues are around the human resources capacity constraints of the licensing authority, as well as technical capacity constraints in terms of being able to allocate precise water use licenses that actually are functional. So here, that failure is utilized to facilitate the introduction of the one environmental system, which looks to deal, or rather look to deal with the issue of extra-legal water use by streamlining licensing decision-making, the intergovernmental licensing decision-making, targeting fragmentation as a problem that led to extra-legal water use, because the DMR will issue a mining license, but a mine doesn't have a water use license, but the mine will operate nonetheless, therefore operating extra-legally. But then the 300 days that was introduced for licensing decision-making in the streamlined licensing decision-making timeline was impractical in terms of the technical studies that need to go into licensing decision-making. You require all sorts of studies, EIAs, studies on waste and discharge impacts and so on. And these typically take quite some time, and quite some time is also required for the assessment of the outcomes of these studies. So I do recall, I think the president in a State of Nation address, I think 2 years ago or so, alarmingly to me, even talking about 90 days now, rather than 300 days. So that should raise questions about what is happening behind the scenes in terms of the technical processes that are required for decision making. So the outcome of this is, for instance, weak water use licenses that are imprecise and inaccurate in terms of their licensing conditions. For instance, one informant was talking about a water use license for a mine that actually had benchmarks for drinking quality water. And then part of the impact of the OES was the shifting of the responsibilities between the DWS and the DMR, putting EIAs under the DMR, even as the DMR would have been conflicted in terms of it having a mining promotion mandate, and now it has to be dealing with water and sort of environmental issues around EIAs. And then another issue was was failures in enforcement in terms of the lack of water audits and inspection visits. Typically, a water use license is allocated 6 to 8 months. There should be a water audit to check this new water user, how are they complying with their licensing conditions. And then after that, there should be, I think typically a year later, an inspection to see how particular issues that were brought up in terms of non-compliance were handled. But clearly there's a lack of capacity. Again, political decision in terms of not capacitating the enforcement authority. And also the other element is that coal mines have a responsibility in the water regulatory enforcement process to collect data. They've got testing stations at particular points that are outlined in their water use licenses. And they have to typically collect that water, test it in labs, report to the DWS. But you find that some mines shift those testing stations around to try and avoid accountability. So what does this mean in terms of water struggles in Delmas? I think we can say that water use licenses have been undermined as an instrument for the fair and equal enforcement of equitable access and use of water. Also, the delays in the exercise of the authority of the licensing authority means that there's a circumvention of procedural fairness by the coal mines, meaning that they can engage in extralegal water use. And typically we can view that as a lack of recognition of the water use needs of agricultural users who are quite sensitive to water quality issues. And also here we see there's a gap between here we see that there's a there's a gap between what is de jure recognition for instance, agricultural users, and de facto non-recognition in practice. You go back to the slide that I was talking about in terms of licensing, decision-making framework, everything will look like it's in place for the right sort of decision-making that in a balanced and fair way protects other water users, but in practice that is not the case. And also extra-legal water use means that there's no space for participation for water users in terms of influencing the process of decision-making and the allocation of water use licenses. And also the OES, the introduction of the OES sort of dealt with sort of problems that were about facilitating the water use of coal mines, but did not go to the issues that are problematic for the DWS, like for instance issues of capacity. And all that did at the end of the day affects the rigor of water use licenses, particularly in terms of its licensing conditions. Down the line, that affects enforcement as well. So that means that the OES, in a way, allows coal mines to circumvent rigorous enforcement. And you can see here, there's the OES operates in such a way where there's a preferential recognition of the water use of coal mines on an economic basis over the water use of farmers, or even actually water bodies in terms of their protection. Yeah. I think I touched on these issues. Yeah. Again, I think this speaks to us understanding, because issues of the failings of the enforcement authority are almost dealt with as if they're just technical failings. The Water Regulatory Enforcement Authority failed to conduct water audits and inspections, they don't know what they're doing, etc., etc. But actually there's political decision-making in terms of not giving the Water Regulatory Enforcement Authority the capacity to actually carry out its mandate. So, in conclusion, I would want to say that perhaps we can consider the water regulation of coal mines and the regulatory processes in a place like Delmas as a form of state capital cooperation, considering also how critical those areas are for the coal supply of power stations. Incidentally, all of these case study mines that I was talking about were supplying coal to power stations, ESCOM's power stations. So unfair, unequal, the unfair and unequal construct of water regulation and their practices, we can consider them as normalizing the potential of future water scarcity. So contemporary unfair and unequal regulatory practices bring about contestations over the future of water in a place like Delmas. So what that means is that typically you go to Delmas, you're likely not going to find complete scarcity in terms of water quantity. You might find the water there, you might find, even in terms of water quality, things are not so far gone that you absolutely cannot use the water. But be that as it may, already these sorts of water regulatory practices are triggering water struggles over, I suppose, what the farmers considered to be future water scarcity in terms of completely polluted water, and that would mean the end of farming in a place like Delmas. So, yeah, I think I will leave it there, colleagues. If there's some things that I left out or I didn't quite make sense, or maybe I went too fast in some things, you're free to ask questions. Hopefully I can answer.
Okay, thank you very much, Lesego. So we are now at 2 p.m. This is a lunch break. I know a lot of you have need to get back to work. So by 2:30 we will wrap up. I will take maybe 2 or 3 questions. We'll do it like that in rounds, and Lesego will respond. May I also, just before we get to that, say that there are some registers in circulation, and we'd really appreciate it if you could sign them and move them along. Thank you. So do we have any thoughts, questions, comments?
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation and congratulations on your writing. I think in all that not all, but what I've managed to browse through and what I've been listening to you speak about, what's missing for me that I would like to hear from you is like, why did you do this study? Like, what is the reason?
Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, Lesego. Thank you for a great presentation. Just a quick one from me. A couple of years ago, I read an article which spoke about the impact of coal mining on women, and it was particularly focusing on the on society and women's access to water in mining towns in Mpumalanga as well. I'm not sure exactly where those towns were. But a direct question for you is that in the process of this research, have you come across maybe case studies or incidents where there has been a standoff between the community and coal mining companies over the use of water resources? Because you do talk about contestation for water resources, but I don't think you make it clear who the contestation is amongst. Is it just the coal mining companies amongst themselves, or is it the community versus the coal mining companies? If you can just make that clear for me. Thank you.
Sure, thanks. Do we have?
Thanks, Lesego. I think it was in this very room that another paper, a working paper on coal mining, was launched a few years ago, which you had co-written with Cali Forest. And I haven't read that paper in quite a long time, but I seem to recall that the situation that existed in Delmas at that time was one in which the coal mines were the Goliath and water users were definitely the Davids, and that the Department of Minerals and Energy, maybe, I don't know if on purpose, but there was an environment which favored the coal mines very strongly. I'm curious as to whether that situation has changed at all in the last 6 or 7 years. Can you compare your findings now with your findings then?
Thank you. I'm going to hand over to Lesego now to respond.
Why I did this research? Money, yeah. Yeah. Originally, I was going to look at platinum mining and the issues of water around there, because they have been around Rustenburg and so on. But luckily, my supervisor, Sonobile, said, listen, I managed to get some money. Are you interested in making a switch? Great decision, because making that switch meant I fell into, accidentally, energy reform debates, and I realized that actually I'm looking at the primary level of those energy reform debates in terms of the practices around the water use of coal mines and how they are effectively allowed to use water as they wish in that area. So the short answer, money, but the long answer is that I have a water services background, and I wanted to make the switch to water resources and do it in an extractive context. So landing on this topic accidentally allowed me to look at issues of the influence of water regulation on the water use of coal mines. Yeah. No. The question that you're asking about how water struggles happen. I think if I'm going a little bit, in front of what you say. Look, I mean, for some time I went in that direction, and I had to come back because I realized that there hadn't been research that looks at even understanding conceptually what are the issues around water struggle. So here, me talking about normalization of water scarcity is an outcome of that, in terms of the core issue of contestation is this normalization of water scarcity, and it actually works in such a way where counterintuitively, water might still be there, but there are heavy contestations around that water, and those are connected to sort of the future of water. And that's sort of, if you go into the literature, someone like Karen Backer, who talks about the biophysical nature of water, its variability in space and time. So you can think of it in that way. Pollution now, but impacts later, and that triggers those sorts of water struggles, as if there's scarcity now. But there is value in researching the actual struggle. I mean, I did come across that data. I've got I've got a lot of it, but I had to let it go, well, that avenue, and study, because I felt that this comes first and that will come later. Yeah. In terms of comparing the two working papers, I would say the situation is the same. Despite what we might be thinking in terms, I do know we might be thinking there's decarbonization happening, the push towards that, mobilization around energy justice, and so on. And we might be thinking that the minerals energy complex is not what it used to be, and maybe it isn't, but it's still there. Like for instance, another element that has come of late in terms of the shifts around the minerals energy complex, like maybe I shouldn't say the criminalization, but criminalization, but it's still there. And it still requires coal supply for it to function. And the criminalization you can also think of as the addition or the entry of new players who are very, very much interested in the continuation of the minerals energy complex. The coal transporters, they're still there, and they're not interested in this thing going away. So there's a shift, a new sort of symbiosis where you'll find coal miners, now suddenly have allies in sort of, criminalized sort of entities, and they sort of, for the time being, pushing in the same direction, but in other ways they're in conflict, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I'll come back to you. So 1, 2, and then 3.
Okay. Thank you very much for this research. It's quite eye-opening about what's happening around us. As I was listening, I was having a few questions which I'm not sure maybe if you did answer them in your presentation. Maybe I had some other voices disturbing my listening. But I was thinking in terms of climate justice, for example, because we're talking about water pollution. And I started to have questions like, of course, there is plant health being affected, human health, and there's soil pollution. And this pollution is also a poverty influencer, because maybe people struggle to even plant food, and that situation just makes life even more costly for the communities around Delmas. And so I was just wondering if maybe you have thought of some solutions also in your research after observing all of this. Things like cleaning the soil, because there's different forms of cleaning polluted soil, especially from mines, like planting sunflower, planting cannabis on the soil that is around such areas, and forms of maybe deterring the pollution itself. And lastly, I was just wondering, how can this research be effective in influencing the current policy that seems to be problematic around water issues? Thank you.
Thanks.
Oh, thank you, Mhlegasi. It is definitely an eye-opening over here. Sorry, I can see you're trying to find where I am. I noticed that what seems to be part of the key thrust of your presentation is the inefficiencies around the regulatory instruments. Based on the effect of some of the comments that have come through, one, the Goliath David analogy given in terms of the mining, two, our reliance in South Africa, especially on sort of like the fossil fuels right now as a primary driver of our energy sources. And then three, focusing on the scarcity that is then created. Would you maybe comment on the possibility of this inefficiency being also a created phenomenon rather than just lack of capacity? I'm looking at the conclusions that you are drawing, looking at the Goliath-David relationship, and the result that we are having of mechanisms supposed to create a balance suddenly not being able to work. How much of that is just pure inefficiency, and how much of it is possibly created inefficiencies so that they can promote what seems to be what's wanted by the people with access to power and state instruments? Thank you.
Hello. Thank you for the presentation, Lesego. I'm interested in, you use this phrase which you term extra legal, which is the extra legal use of the water. And I'm interested as to why you choosing to call it extra legal instead of unlawful or illegal rather. So my question is, was the companies were using the waters outside of legal approval of the regulatory authorities, was that approved retrospectively, or was it, somehow legalized at a later point in time when the delays or the technical capacity constraints had been overcome? So I'm just interested in why that term extra legal in terms of unlawful or illegal.
Okay. Extra legal, illegal. So in my thesis, I use water grabbing as sort of a theoretical framework to sort of understand what's happening with these water struggles. And there, I think I was influenced by literature there that says, well, to look at things in a dichotomous way, where you say illegal, legal, which is bad, good, or is problematic, because you might not see the bigger picture in how these are actually interconnected, which is sort of what I argue when I talk about how the OES problematizes extra-legal water use to bring itself into existence, or rather political decision makers do that to bring the OES into existence, and that functions to facilitate legal water use for coal mines, but in a way that undermines the licensing authority and the enforcement authority of Department of Water and Sanitation. On climate justice and solutions, I don't have solutions. Unfortunately, it's such a big problem. I don't even want to be arrogant and say, oh, I've got solution. I don't. But on this level, around the issues of water regulation, I think when we're talking water justice issues, water struggles, we can start there. You know, on the one hand, and this is what was coming out from the informants, can water regulation function? You know, on the other hand, there were contestations around, no, we don't want it functioning like this, you know. So those are the things that we need to get right to say, okay, well, as much as coal mines are polluting water users, at least we've got a regulatory system that sort of deals with the outcomes of that pollution, mitigates and so on. In terms of influencing policy on water, look, part of the challenge is that the department, so I talk about the OES and intergovernmental licensing reforms. Part of the challenge is that the OES brought about intergovernmental licensing hierarchies in terms of authority, so that the DMR has a stronger authority in practice than the DWS. That's on top of an existing situation where the DMR, now DMRE, the DMR as the custodian of mining, you're not going to say anything to the DMR. They do what they want, you know. And on this side, DWS is very much operating like a secondary partner that is just supposed to give the water use licenses, you know. And then the OES, by putting in place these hierarchies, cements that, you know. So I really don't know what, I mean, I've talked to DWS officials that are frustrated themselves. So this is part of the struggles. I use the struggles in an elastic way. They're not out in the streets toying, they're not, but they're voicing that they don't like this thing. They don't have the authority, they'd like to act, but it can be deleterious to your career, you know? And then on the dysfunction of water regulation and whether it's purposeful, yeah, it's connected. It is definitely purposeful, yeah. And I mean, I might sound like I'm, you know, I'm for the farmers and I'm against the coal mines and what. Look, a lot of what we've been able to achieve in the last 30 years has still operated around the MEC, you know, in terms of us being able to have the tax revenue and so on to distribute to education, healthcare, etc. So I'm not saying the MES is some sort of devil that needs to be collapsed overnight. Connected to that is that, you know, there are all sorts of jobs there, you know. But as much as we don't want to sort of do away with it overnight, we can't allow a situation that's happening clearly in front of us where, and I didn't mention this, that area of Delmas, Ochis, Leandra, actually that Mpumalanga area holds something like 54% of our high potential soil, you know, of which I can't remember the way it was stated, but we don't have a lot of it in South Africa. It's not like we've got spectacularly rich soil, but Mpumalanga has 54% of it. Yet this is where you find also the coal deposits, and the mining is happening right there. Right now, we're starting to talk about issues of people starving in South Africa, food shortages. Well, the food is there, people can't afford it. And as you lose this land to coal mining, which people say it can take 200 years to rehabilitate, you know, what does that do in terms of food prices? Maybe not now, but in the long term, yeah.
Thank you. I think we have time for one or two more questions, if there are any in the room. Okay, I see 1, 2, 3, and then we're going to leave it there. And can I ask that we do try to keep it quite brief so that everyone can, so we can wrap up on time. Thank you.
No, my question is whether there has been a case where the state takes on the mining companies for the lack of complying with regulation, and also what are your views around decarbonization and this green hydrogen talk that is currently happening, where South Africa being water scarce, but we have been earmarked to sort of spearhead this project, and mining companies like Anglo in the Makalakwena areas sort of have been earmarked to spearhead these projects around green hydrogen. And what are your views around that, and whether the transition is just in your view?
Thank you for your presentation. My question is around how we perceive or conceptualize water. So you spoke about water as an economic resource and water as a secular something. So my question relates to what happens when we view water as a spiritual resource in line with indigenous hydro infrastructures. And yeah, so that's my question.
Hi, hi everyone. My name is Ivan from the Demography and Population Studies Department. I have two questions. So the first one is briefly that on your conceptual framework, you had fairness on one side and equity on the other side. I'm just wondering what's the difference between fairness and equity. And then my second question is the conclusion that, you know, the state is central to the normalization of the potential of future water scarcity and coal mining water struggles over the future of water and its uses in Delmas. I think that's a very serious conclusion to reach, and I'm just wondering, are there any areas that you think are showing signs of a similar thing? Because I think we should be really quite concerned. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Lesego.
To start with that last point, that look, I mean, that whole Mpumalanga, you know, well, maybe not whole, but the mining side of it, because there's the sort of tourism side. But Witbank, etc. I mean, Ochis has been devastated. And also you're finding, like for instance, Delmas represents a movement westward in that Witbank coalfield, as now they've exhausted sort of like the mining around, well, not exhausted, but there's geological decline. So now there's movement westward. So yeah, the impacts are all over. And also if you look, there's a map that I didn't include. If you look at the land that's either under licensing, mining licensing, or prospecting licensing, or rather prospecting in that Delmas area. And that's almost the whole of Delmas, you know. Sort of like almost Mpumalanga, they talk about something like 67-68% of the total land cover being under either mining licensing or prospecting. And that is connected to, let's go back to, you said, sir, that if there is, has the state ever successfully taken on coal mines in terms of non-compliance? No, there's no interest, is what I'm trying to get to. I mean, there'll be maybe posturing in terms of, oh, you know, we need stronger regulation, etc., whatever. But in real terms, there's no interest. There was a case where, I can't remember the name of the coal mine, but it was mining near Mapungube. And actually this whole thing of the OES was kickstarted by that court decision, because that mine was mining without a water use license. And then the court found that it was actually mining illegally. But that was environmental NGOs taking that case to court. The state not really interested. And part of it is because if you go to a place like Delmas, they'll tell you that, oh no, all these politicians, they're owners here. They've got mines here. So they're not interested. On the issue of green hydrogen, look, I can't talk too much about specifics. I'm not clued up on that, but I'll tell you the just transition. We've got to ask ourselves questions around what does that look like when it comes to the so-called minerals of the future, metals of the future. Is there no mining there? And if there is, what does it look like? Are we talking about sort of as part of the just energy transition? We are saying there's a new mining transition. I'd like to hear things like that from even the coal, not even coal, but the mines themselves. And just to close off, the last one will be the fairness one. Water as a spiritual medium, or very interesting question. They would understand exactly what you were talking about if you were in South America, in the Andes. When you talk about water as alive and having human rights and so on, water as an ancestor, But if you bring that language here, I don't think we've been able to preserve those ontologies of water. I remember one lady in the Western Cape talking about how the indigenous people there, the Khoi people, used to have some sort of like a water spirit that was female, she explains it. I don't know if it brought rain or it helped with what, but those things were there. But how many of those things can we talk about? We don't know those things anymore. Maybe vendor people might disagree. People from vendor. The last one, fairness and equity. To close off, fairness is more about procedural fairness. That's the way it's sort of captured in literature. Very much connected to issues of equality. Anybody who applies for a water use license or applies for a water right should be treated fairly and be able to get a fair decision. You didn't get a water use license, but it's not because you are you. It's just that it doesn't make sense on whatever level, But the reality is that if we deal with equality like that, then we overlook things like gender, because I agree we're all equal. But in that equality, there's inequity in terms of historically, some people have not been able to access, water and use water. So if we're equal, now we're disappearing them. Equity is just about the equitable access of water.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Lesego. That is perfect timing. It is 2:30. Before we say goodbye and thank you, I just want to, those of you who are on the SWOP mailing list will know about these things. Lesego's today, and tomorrow SWOP is having a silk screening workshop at the art school, making t-shirts and posters discussing the question of elections and democracy. On the 21st of May, that is next week, Tuesday, We are having a screening linked to the question of solidarity with Palestine and the particular position of Germany in that. It's called The Price of Solidarity. And on the 22nd of May, we are going to be having another discussion here again about democracy and about elections, and we're going to have some presenters from South America and from Senegal, so that we can put our election into conversation with the other elections that are happening around the world this year. So that's the SWOP program for the rest of May. We hope to perhaps see some of you at future events. And yes, I think let's just say thank you very much to Lesego and to all of you for your participation. Thanks for being here. And as always, Mantis.